Hello and welcome back to Vintage Disney here on Brian's Things Are Cool. If you're like me and love classic reruns, you may find yourself wondering what those classic characters you've always loved have been up to since the final episode. The powers that be often responded to this thought with the reunion show. Sometimes these are one-off specials like I Dream of Jeannie 15 years later, A Very Brady Christmas, and sometimes they'd get a full-on reunion series, like 1995's reboot of Get Smart, or the Disney Channel's Still the Beaver. With streaming, the trend continues, for better or for worse. Now imagine one where literally none of the original cast wanted to return. Doesn't exactly fill you with much confidence there, does it? But Zorro and Son. I briefly mentioned Zorro and Son in my first tribute to the Disney Channel video when talking about the 1950s Zorro, but this reboot series aired on CBS between April and June of 1983. Henry Calvin, who played the lovable Sergeant Garcia in the original series, had passed away in October of 1975. Gene Sheldon, who had played Diego's mute sidekick Bernardo, passed away in May of 1982. The concept of a continuation of a beloved series kind of hinges on having at least one member of the original cast. Luckily, Zorro himself, Guy Williams, was still around, and he was actually asked to star in this reboot. Guy Williams had retired from acting at that point, and due to some good investments, was living the good life in Argentina. But the idea of returning to the role that had made him a local hero in Argentina did interest him. That is, until he read the script and quickly walked away from the project. The new series would be set 20 years after the original and opted for a more comedic tone. Henry Darrow took over the role of an older Don Diego de la Vega, marking the second of 3 Zorro projects on his resume. Paul Regina, who most notably played Frank Nitti in the 1993 reboot of the Untouchables TV series, played Diego's son Don Carlos de la Vega. The show's failure is made even sadder given the people behind it. Directors like Gabriel Beaumont was known to direct drama and action shows like Hill Street Blues and Star Trek The Next Generation. On the comedic end, directors like Peter Baldwin had given us episodes of sitcoms like The Andy Griffith Show, The Partridge Family, and Sanford & Son. And Alan Meyerson directed one of my favorite slapstick comedies, Police Academy 5, Assignment Miami Beach.
Hey, what's happening, Dork? Hey, Dork. Hey, Dork.
The writers of each episode, Eric Cohen and Nick Arland, have classics like Welcome Back, Kotter and The Golden Girls on their resume. The producer of the series was even a Disney legend, Kevin Moochie Corcoran. So what happened? Episode 1, The Pilot, which aired on April 6, 1983. After a title sequence with slightly rewritten lyrics of the original theme indicating there are now 2 Zorros, the episode begins with a monk, played by Jerry's dad from Seinfeld, Barney Martin, being pulled through the streets of Los Angeles by a horse, led by our pompous and imbecilic villain, Comandante Paco Pico. The Comandante and his second-in-command, Sergeant Sepulveda, are led to the tavern set from the original series for some rum, where we're treated to 2 diarrhea jokes back-to-back from Sergeant Sepulveda, who I guess is this show's version of Sergeant Garcia without the likability.
What of the Black Fox? The Curse of Capistrano. The Curse of Capistrano? I believe, my Capitan, if you boil the water before drinking, you will not catch it.
That is the Revenge of Montezuma, not the Curse of Capistrano. The Curse of Capistrano is Zorro.
Scourge of the Camino Real. The Scourge of Camino Real? I once picked up a bad case of the Scourge on leave in San Francisco.
Oh, idiot.
Wouldn't be as bad if they didn't opt to use an audience laugh track after every joke. Only a few minutes in and I can completely understand why Guy Williams didn't want to be in this. With them is Comandante La Brea, played by Jack Crushen. Crushen is one of 2 actors in this series that actually appeared on the original show. Comandante Paco Pico is concerned about Zorro. La Brea tells him not to be scared of Zorro as he's an old man now, just as Zorro shows up. I, of course, would have loved to see Guy Williams back in the role, but Henry Darrow is probably the best actor in the series. Plus, given his role as Don Alejandro de la Vega in the Family Channel Zorro, it's nice to see a connection between both Zorros that I grew up on. A sword fight breaks out, which does feel quite a bit like the original series. Unfortunately, it ends with a pratfall and, you guessed it, more canned laughter from the laugh track. Diego is able to get away and is talking to Bernardo about how hard it is getting older. Bernardo can now talk, which is almost an even more bothersome change than the comedic tone. By being a mute who pretends he can't hear, Bernardo is invaluable to Diego as his eyes and ears. Here, he's just another broadly played character in a show of nothing but broadly played characters. There's a knock at the door and Diego's son Carlos is there, having returned from college after receiving a letter from Bernardo. The monk's twin brother stops by as well to tell Diego about what has happened to his brother, and has brought his ward Anita with him, who Carlos takes an instant liking to. Anita is played by Catherine Parks from Weekend at Bernie's.
Did everything go okay up there?
Never been better.
Oh, good.
Carlos, though just back in town, agrees to go speak on the monk's behalf. Bernardo tells Diego that he lied to Carlos in the letter and says that the real reason he sent for him was because it's time for Diego to train a replacement for Zorro. Carlos is taken aback by how lawless the government of Los Angeles has become and demands a complete transcript of the charges against the monk. Comandante Paco Pico says he doesn't have a transcript, but he has it on cassette. This being a lame joke to introduce Corporal Cassette, played by John Muschetta Jr., who any early 90s kid would recognize as the Micro Machine Man.
Good people of Los Angeles, the prisoner is charged with selling wine before his time. I have before me 2 bottles of wine. One of the brothers happens to know, one of the brothers rotten guts. Hot and but if you be so kind. Well, the wine is fine. I come in, I think not too complex, but a good bouquet, going on through the almost injured. Each one has dramatic details, terrific trim, precision paint jobs, plus incredible micro machine pocket play sets. There's a police station, fire station, restaurant, service station, and more.
Carlos is convinced that something needs to be done, and Diego, happy to hear this, reveals his true identity as Zorro, and talks his son into allowing him to train him to one day take up the mantle of the Fox. Now it's up to father and son to rescue the monk from Comandante Paco Pico. Episode 2, Beauty and the Mask, which aired on April 13th, 1983. This episode starts off in the tavern, as a beautiful flamenco dancer named Angelica performs all over the familiar set, looking just as it did in 1957. As she gets to the door, she slips out. Angelica is in Los Angeles running guns to the rebels, and Comandante Paco Pico is hot on her trail after the escape. Meanwhile, Carlos has agreed to help the monk teach biology to a class of children, just as Angelica rushes into the mission seeking asylum. The monk isn't able to hide her as he has no place left and has to turn her away. Angelica is caught by Paco and his men, but Carlos shows up as Zorro and saves her. It was love at first sight for Carlos, and he brings her to the De La Vega Hacienda to keep her safe. Bernardo takes Angelica's shoes to town for repair, which tips off Paco as to where she is, and he heads to the hacienda to make the arrest. Carlos shows up as Zorro and saves her again. He takes her back to the Zorro cave, I guess that's what they call it, and gauges her response when he asks what she thinks of Don Carlos. When she laughs, Carlos is heartbroken but decides to continue to pursue the relationship as Zorro. Despite Paul Regina not being very imposing as Zorro, I mean, he sounds like Burt Ward.
No, it won't work. I mean, you don't love me. Adore, worship, idolize, yes, but love? No.
What does a turkey do when he flies upside down?
He gobbles up.
This is one of the stronger episodes of the series, and by removing some of the comedic elements, could work as a legitimately good Zorro story. Episode 3, A Fistful of Pesos, which aired on April 20th, 1983. We open on the main courtyard set from the original series as Comandante Paco Pico is berating a man accused of helping Zorro. The idea of a villain attacking a man for helping Zorro is a typical plot point, but our villain being played as such an idiot can wear a bit thin at times. Some of the humor here feels like something out of a cartoon. Meanwhile, Carlos de la Vega is having his breakfast served by Bernardo. Carlos wants to give himself a character to play when he's not Zorro, much like his father Diego pretends to be a lazy playboy. He decides to play the role of a gambling womanizer, which, as Bernardo points out, is pretty close to the truth already. Comandante Paco Pico has decided to take care of his Zorro problem by dressing up as Zorro himself and ruining Zorro's reputation by robbing the poor. When he robs from the monk, Diego hears the news and suspects his son is the culprit due to his gambling habits. Paco strikes again and puts Diego's fears to rest about his son, but not before the townspeople chase him off, thinking he's given up his role as a friend of the poor. One of the townspeople, in a blink and you'll miss it cameo, is our other actor from the original series, Don Diamond, who fans of the 50s series know as Sergeant Garcia's sidekick, Corporal Reyes. The monk comes to Carlos with his fear that fake Zorro plans to steal the sacred skillet, which was used the day after the Last Supper for the last brunch. This is supposedly their idea of humor. As the monk leaves the skillet with the De La Vegas, Paco breaks into their home to steal it, where he's met by Diego Zorro. The plot comes to a screeching halt for forced slapstick and a brief sword fight in the De La Vega living room. I don't believe the interior set of the De La Vega living room is the same set from the 1950s series, but the De La Vega patio set is instantly recognizable. With Paco defeated once more, Zorro and Son have again brought justice to the people of Los Angeles. Episode 4, Wash Day, which aired on May 4th, 1983. It's laundry day for Bernardo, and just as he hangs Zorro's suit out to dry, a gust of wind sends it into the reach of Comandante Paco Pico, who's having a picnic with Anita. Paco arrests Bernardo and threatens to whip him until he admits that Don Diego is Zorro. Instead, Bernardo says he is Zorro. Don Carlos and Diego must save Bernardo, but Bernardo has shrunk their outfits in the wash. Now they have to find a spare in order to free Bernardo. I don't really know what to say about this episode. It's a baffling storyline. Adam West's Batman was campy, but they never had a plot based around Laundry Day. It's short on action as well, and of all the episodes, probably shouldn't have been allowed to air. And the final episode, Episode 5, The Butcher of Barcelona, which aired on June 1st, 1983. Comandante Paco Pico and Sergeant Sepulveda are enjoying a beautiful day in the Pueblo of Los Angeles when Sepulveda gives Paco the bad news that El Excelente is coming to town to inspect the Pueblo. Paco isn't very happy with this news. Meanwhile, Carlos is about to go on his very first solo mission as Zorro, and Diego tells him about his first mission, facing off against the Butcher of Barcelona. El Excelente, played by Jaime from Get Smart, Dick Gutierrez, arrives in town with his bodyguard, Captain Jorge Mendez, and isn't impressed by Paco's work. Bernardo is in town to see this and runs back to let Diego know that El Excelente's bodyguard is none other than the Butcher of Barcelona. Paco comes to Don Diego for help in keeping his position. It doesn't work, and Paco is fired unless he can catch Zorro within 24 hours. With the Butcher of Barcelona in line to take Paco's job, Diego agrees to help Paco to avoid having a greater evil in power. This means staging a fake capture. Carlos agrees to the plan. As El Excelente, the Butcher, and Paco sit down for lunch, Zorro shows up according to the plan, but it's Diego, not Carlos. Diego takes out the Butcher once and for all, and El Excelente decides not to fire Paco after all. This is another one of the stronger episodes. I could see this working on the Family Channel Zorro, as it would have been more of a one-off episode rather than serialized as the 1950s series was. At just 5 episodes, this is the shortest short-lived series I've ever seen, and it took me forever to find it on bootleg. It's certainly not going to reach the heights of top adaptations of the character like Douglas Fairbanks, Guy Williams, Duncan Regehr, or even Antonio Banderas. The action is mediocre and even a little stiff. The humor is dreadful, but I will say there are a few chuckles here and there.
Is there someplace you can hide her?
Well, there is one.
See?
Under my robe. But I fear it is already occupied by a family of homeless migrant workers. Everyone okay down there?
It's all right.
There are a couple episodes that have good storylines, and the overall idea of Zorro training his son to take his place is interesting. It reminds me a little bit of the Phantom's backstory of each son in the family taking up the mantle of the Phantom when the father dies. Zorro and Son is an oddity for fans of Zorro. It's a chance to see all of the original sets and costumes from the 1950s series used one more time. The new comedic tone and changes to established characters will have you scratching your head as to how exactly this is connected to the original series, but I think there's just enough here to make it worth a watch. As Diego tells his son, you usually don't have time for anything fancy. You've got to get in, make your Z, and get out. Thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed my look back on Zorro and Son. If you'd like to be kept up to date as to when I release a new video, go ahead, hit that subscribe button. And if you really want to be notified, hit that bell as well. I'm Brian, and I'll see you next time on Vintage Disney.